Hello. Previous attempts at patent law reform in the US may have faltered, but that doesn't mean that they're off the cards entirely. Arguably, the real question is only when will another push at law reform happen and what shape will it take? Now, Chris Israel, who spent 7 years in the White House under President George W. Bush, including as International Coordinator for Intellectual Property Enforcement, joined American Continental Group in 2010 and told IPBC Global's Richard Lloyd what were the reasons for why that initial attempt at reform faltered.
I think there's a lot of factors. It obviously went very quickly through the U.S. House. It's kind of an easier process to move. Had a lot of support early in the year, and I think just gradually as the Senate process became much longer and more in-depth, you saw some of the tougher questions really surface. Issues about fee shifting, which is very controversial for a number of members. I think there were some issues of, are we going a bit too far with this legislative package? Are we taking some steps that might ultimately weaken the overall patent system in the U.S. and make it much more difficult for some real bedrock companies and industries such as the pharmaceutical industry, the biotech industry, some of our tech industries to enforce their patents?
Do you think the delay is a sign of Washington politics working or a reflection of their inability to get anything done?
I think it's a combination of the two. I do think the process became much more in-depth, and a lot of people looked much more closely at what the legislation would actually do when it moved into the Senate. So I think that's kind of the good portion of your question, that there was a much more robust review at an individual member level when it got into the Senate process. But I do think it speaks a bit to the very difficult nature of moving major pieces of legislation in the United States right now. It's much easier to slow or stop a bill than it is to move something very comprehensive forward.
But would you expect some form of legislation to return, perhaps in the next Congress?
I think potentially even this Congress. Congress right now is looking at some more targeted legislation, things to address abuse in the demand letter system. So I think we're advising clients and working with our the folks we work with to really keep a very close eye on some of the more targeted things that could happen, and some of those may be very positive. But I do think the energy is still there, the attention and the focus on this issue of what's going on in the patent litigation space is still very much alive in Washington.
In terms of the work that you do at ACG, if I'm a large patent-owning company wanting to understand the machinery of Washington, and I call you up, how does the process start? How do you explain it?
Well, we spend a lot of time in depth with our clients. Our firm, we've got several senior members of our firm who've spent time at the USPTO, at the various committees on Capitol Hill, and with the administration, working on intellectual property and patent issues. So we really know the legal and policy space. So we sit down and go very in depth with our clients or any potential clients, and kind of help them understand what's going on in Washington, and more specifically how that matters for their individual companies, because some of the issues manifest themselves in different ways depending on where you are in the space and what type of company you are. If you're a large pharmaceutical company or if you're a licensing company, the issues are the same, but how you approach them might be fundamentally different. So that's the starting point, is really helping them understand and build a strategy.
Obviously, this whole process is well established in Washington and the sort of work that you do there. Do you see parallels with other parts of the world, the European Union, for example, or
I think it's getting more active. I think it's very unique in the United States, and kind of the diverse nature of the representation that a lot of companies have. But we work with, we'll be back in Europe again next week to talk about some trade matters in Berlin. Right. So I do think through trade associations and large coalitions of companies, they're paying a very close attention. The U.S. is in two major trade discussions right now with Asian countries and European countries. So that's drawing out some of these issues too.